I allow a person only two yeah buts when I'm on the 12th step call, and then I pick up my hat and head for the door. The speaker was sitting at a coffee bar in an AA club in a large city and had just been introduced to me as the number one 12 stepper in the club. He admitted that he went on a lot of 12 step calls, but insisted that he did it only to help preserve his own sobriety. I'll go most any place at any time, but I don't stay long if they want to argue. I'm not there to argue, but to offer them sobriety. If they want it, we have it for them. If they want to argue, well, they can argue with their neighbors or their wives or the police. Well, all I could think of was the number of times I had argued with alcoholics. After all, I had a commodity for them that would save their lives. Didn't I owe it to them to use all my powers of persuasion to get them to accept it? Wasn't I a skilled, experienced counselor who knew just exactly what to say? Again, it was brought back to the simplicity of the AA program that sobriety lies within the alcoholic. None of my rhetoric will release it. My informant was carrying the message and not the alcoholic, which is the only way to go. The Twilight Zone. I could never understand how anyone could be standing around sipping drinks. My only purpose in drinking from the very beginning was to reach the Twilight Zone as quickly as possible. This observation by a recovering alcoholic gives us one more window through which we can get a glimpse of alcoholics as they really are, and maybe it will help some in the early identification of the alcoholic. Many times I turned down opportunities to drink, particularly in the beginning. I did not want to stop off for a couple of drinks. Drinking for me was serious business, and I didn't want to start unless there was time enough and money enough to make it worthwhile. The alcoholic emphasized that this was early drinking and not drinking that later would get him labeled alcoholic. There is a whole galaxy of drinking behaviors that have not generally been recognized as alcoholic, but if recognized as such, might lead us to an earlier identification of alcoholism. One might ask oneself why someone comes to a party where there will be drinking with a drink already on their breath, or why a certain guest always wants to be a bartender, or why persons avoid a full stomach when they know there is drinking ahead. These are usually symptoms of alcoholism, although they rarely are seen as such. There was a time when we could recognize alcoholics at an early time by observing that they sought out occasions where drinking was on the agenda or created special occasions for drinking. Such occasions are so plentiful that they need neither to be sought out nor to be created, so we lose that particular tool of identification. However, an experienced, sensitive observer can identify an alcoholic earlier than we used to think possible on becoming an alcoholic. From time to time, I have had alcoholics debate with me over my contention that an alcoholic is an alcoholic from the first drink. Now, alcoholics know a great deal more about the disease than I do, and I can be convinced. One woman told me, I can tell almost to the moment when I became an alcoholic. As we discussed the matter further, she restated her position. I can tell you, she said, almost the exact moment alcohol started to cause me problems. There just may be a profound difference between these two statements. Another alcoholic, while telling his story, really showed some deep insight. I started drinking when I was 9 or 10 years old. I seemed to get along all right with drinking until I started having living problems. Then I became what we now call an alcoholic. Taken together, these two statements tell us a lot about the alcoholic. I once heard a knowledgeable person say that a person became an alcoholic when someone first called him an alcoholic. It may be just that alcoholism is what we define as alcoholism. The whole syndrome of physical, social, psychological, and spiritual problems which we define as alcoholism doesn't descend on the alcoholic in one fell swoop, but develops at varying speeds in different alcoholics. When it gets bad enough, someone says, this is alcoholism, sort of like defining appendicitis as the condition that exists after one's appendix ruptures. I just don't know. Is one an alcoholic when one starts to develop a pattern we call alcoholism? Or is one an alcoholic when these problems become more severe? Or is not one an alcoholic until he or she gets into serious trouble? I just don't know. There is no such thing as a free lunch. It has always seemed to me that the drinkers in the old saloon days had it made. For the purchase of a nickel beer, they had access to the free lunch. Not the dry popcorn and pretzels and salted peanuts, but potato salad and ham and pig's feet. Although I grew up a little late for this largesse, it always seemed to me that those were really the good old days. One can only assume that a considerable part of the nickel was profit, or that very few drinkers took advantage of the free lunch. Of one thing we can be certain, however, the lunch wasn't free. Someone paid for it, and it isn't likely that the benefactor was the saloon keeper. I am always impressed in the recovery from alcoholism that there is no such thing as a free lunch. There are no shortcuts to sobriety. Any effort to use medication or other gimmicks alone is bound to fail. Any effort to recover without painful self-examination will simply not work. Once the price has been paid, a spiritual awakening occurs, and we marvel at the recovery of the alcoholic. I have written elsewhere of the necessity of paying the price, and I believe it to be true. Everything must be paid for, and it is only fitting that such a precious thing as sobriety should have so high a price. Is this all there is? Some years ago, there was a song title which was very popular for a while, which expressed this sentiment. I have no idea whether it sprang from a deep understanding of the malaise of our times or whether the songwriter thought it would sell records. Whether or not, what is described with exquisite exactitude is one of the inescapable pains of living. One might assume that this phrase would apply only to the elderly or the retired or those whose children have just left home, but I find this problem over and over again in people of every age. Every so often we seem to look up from whatever activities have been occupying us, take a deep breath and say, "Is this all there is?" This seems to be one of the psychic pains with which the alcoholic deals by drinking. The better job or flashier car or better golf score or the neighbor's spouse somehow doesn't live up to expectations. A friend dies or we have major surgery or children find out they can do very well without us, thank you. And the refrain echoes through our souls. Is that all there is? One of the signs I look for indicating the real recovery of the alcoholic is the gradual fading of this pain. The solution seems to come in many parts, but the first seems to be the establishment of a working arrangement with a higher power, which I call God. The second phrase seems to be the creation of the sound self-esteem, which is so perfectly summed up in the street phrase, "God don't make no junk." The third seems to be to learn to love and be loved without being threatened by either. Not strangely at all, the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous furnishes the means for achieving all these goals. With the solution that AA provides, whatever there is seems to be enough. The turning point. I have sometimes had alcoholics come to me with stars in their eyes and say, "Do you remember what you said on such and such a date?" I usually don't remember what state I was in on that date, let alone what I might have said. They then go on to recount some simple statement which seems to contain no great wisdom and say that this was the turning point at which their sobriety began. I like to be a big shot as well as the next person, and I would enjoy being able to feel that I was really the catalyst that brought about their sobriety. What really seems to have happened, however, is that the change we call a spiritual awakening has already taken place in their hearts and minds, and the quote they give such importance to is merely a peg on which they can hang their sobriety. I don't discount the importance of carrying the message to alcoholics whenever or however possible, because no one ever knows when this awakening may take place. I do feel, however, that their awakening is far, far more important than anything I might say. One can go on and state a simple truth, a truth that has an application far beyond the field of alcoholism. It is not so much what happens to us that is important, but how we react to it. When alcoholics tell us the dreadful things that have happened to them to cause them to get drunk, it's not hard. Think of people who have had even worse things happen to them who didn't get drunk over them. One of the weakest arguments I know of is that poverty or oppression or child abuse or broken homes cause alcoholism. Countless people have weathered such distress and have not become alcoholics, and countless people who have suffered no such pain have become alcoholics. It's not what happens to us, but how we react that makes us noble or ignoble. Insanity. Here's a word that has fallen into disrepute except in the legal field, and even there it is constantly being redefined. But we know what it means. Insanity to the layperson represents an incomprehensible deviation from the norm, which causes people to do and say things that are unexplainable. We can't define insanity, but we know it when we see it. Now let's take people who ingest substances that make them into completely different persons. While they are under the influence of that substance, they say and do things which severely hurt those whom they love, both physically and mentally. They risk their lives, injure their bodies, damage their brain, and lose their jobs. They lose their self-respect, their position in life, and are lucky if they don't lose life itself. Then, when they're so sick that they can scarcely function, they use whatever resources are left to them to find some more of the substance and continue the process. If this isn't insanity, then the word should be removed from the language. Surely we can help alcoholics realize that this is insanity. Surely we can show them that their behavior is far from rational behavior. Another way of looking at it is that insanity is engaging in the same behavior, drinking over and over again, expecting a different result. Once they're convinced that their behavior is insane, perhaps we can convince them that a higher power can bring them to sanity. Better living through chemistry. I don't suppose the Madison Avenue flack who invented this little gem had any idea that it contained a truth that supersedes most of the erudite writing of the age. When I read it, I can imagine the alcoholic carefully measuring out a 7-to-1 martini to assume that for the next few minutes life will be better. Or the wine grower who, after tasting the last batch, adds a little antifreeze to assure those who pay a small fortune for a bottle of the best will live better through his particular brand of chemistry. Did you ever wonder why the manufacturers of various kinds of booze fight so hard to keep the contents off the label? Look at your medicine cabinet or dressing table. There is no human condition that, according to those who try to lead us, cannot be bettered by rubbing in, spraying on, inhaling, ingesting, injecting, or otherwise assimilating some chemical, particularly the one they are selling. The purveyors of alcohol have brought this science to its finest height. Alcohol becomes a reward, an enhancer of pleasure, a promoter of good fellowship, and finally, a way of demonstrating the status you have achieved. Now alcoholics arrive on the scene. They have been raised in a world which promotes better living through chemistry. They sample the chemical alcohol and find that it works. All the things they say about it are true. The system works. After they have crashed and burned a few hundred times, we arrive on the scene. We try to tell them that the system does not work and that that's why they are strapped down on a bed. Marvel no more that they do not believe you. The wine remembers. I have often wondered what I would say to a visitor from another planet, where there was no yeast and hence no alcohol, when I was asked to explain how our society regarded this particular substance. I wouldn't know where to start, but perhaps a good place would be to sit down in front of the TV with this alien to look at the way alcohol is presented to our society. First and most obvious, of course, would be the commercials for alcohol in its many forms. We would look at the relationship presented between beer and sports. We see the finest athletes our world can furnish, both at a college and professional level. Then the announcer says, "And now this." We see a group of people who look very much like the athletes, young, attractive, obviously prosperous, and happy, drinking beer. It doesn't get any better than this. By inference, one is led to feel that the athletes not only use the substance, but they are probably the best because they use it. Then, what are offered up are the wine commercials. Some dumpy little twerp is literally besieged by beauties because he has a certain kind of wine at his table. A great bearded giant sits in a cathedral atmosphere and intones with great solemnity, "We will sell no wine before it's time." A California Gothic couple stands in a field admiring the grapes, showing again what a benign substance comes from those grapes. Real class. One could go on to other media. A high-class magazine to which I subscribed had 19 full-color ads for booze in the issue before Christmas. When you want to give the best. Of course, our alien visitor would want to read the food columns. Every column praises the fruit of the vine endlessly to attract the wine snobs. No meal is considered gourmet unless it has at least 4 wines plus a before and after drink. This is called civilized dining. I guess this subject is too great to handle in this manner. It would require a book in itself. So let us take our visitor from outer space back to the flying saucer and give up. On the way, we see a dreadful smash-up in which 4 people are killed. What happened here? The visitor asks. It's really nothing. It happens every day. The chances are 50-50 that one or both of the drivers have been drinking what we call alcohol. What's that big building? That's a hospital for those who have found alcohol to be a way of life. What are these attractive buildings with the neon lights in front of them which say open? Those are the temples in which the substance is dispensed. Those old beat-up cars in the parking lot belong to the drinkers, and the Continental on the end belongs to the priest who oversees the drinking rights. The visitor climbs aboard the spacecraft, shaking all 3 heads. Thanks for the tour. I just don't believe I'll mention this alcohol in my report. We have rubber rooms on my planet, too. Those days of wine and roses. I guess the best movie of any kind I ever saw about alcoholism was Days of Wine and Roses, even better than Lost Weekend. Unfortunately, the lesson that many people got from the movie was that if you like chocolate, you're apt to become an alcoholic. But the lesson was there, the lesson we can't seem to learn. Both the husband and wife were alcoholics. And in the beginning, they had a great time. Their courtship was enhanced. Their good times were better, and the parties were more fun because they drank. The lesson was not so obscure that it should escape us. Alcohol was special to them. It worked just exactly as the Madison Avenue Flack said it would. It was equally obvious to the discerning observer that both were alcoholics from the first drink, and nobody called them alcoholics until they did get into trouble. The first phase was Days of Wine and Roses. The second phase was Days of Trouble. The third phase was Days of Searching. Not a search for a way to stop drinking, but for a way to go back to the days of wine and roses. To keep the movie short enough to use, it was necessary to condense this phase of alcoholism, but it goes on for 10 or 20 or 30 years. Then the fourth phase begins the search for sobriety. After some false starts, the man found sobriety through an intervention of a higher power and the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. The woman didn't find sobriety in the movie, and I will always remember her words, "Without a drink, everything looks so goddamn dirty." I haven't seen the Days of Wine and Roses for many years, but it should be a part of every training course for alcoholism counselors. It's really postgraduate study. For everything there is a season. I do not suppose the writer of Ecclesiastes had the same thing in mind when they said, "For everything there is a season," as alcoholics have in mind when they say, "I needed every drink I ever took." But they are saying the same thing. We often feel the need to say something when alcoholics who are currently not drinking send their litany of how tough it is, how nobody understands them, how things are no better than when they were drinking. What we feel like saying is, why don't you go back to drinking? You're no good to yourself or anyone else when you feel this way. And at least when you were drinking, you were sometimes too drunk to bother anybody. But we don't say this, or at least we don't say it very often. The alcoholic might just take us at our word and get drunk. I'm a little reluctant to say there is a time to drink and a time to get sober, but there is a certain grim logic involved. Often there does not seem to be a chance for alcoholics to get sober. They have exhausted all the self-cures and the efforts to go back to the good drinking. As a result, they drink, and too often they don't get sober until they've had enough. We all puzzle with the thought that if we could shorten the period of to drink and bring about the season to recover at an earlier time, we would save the lives of many who now don't survive long enough to recover. So far, our ideas do not seem to be adequate. A pearl of great price. I owe this thought to my friend Norm. The principle is so simple and so obvious that I should have thought about it years ago. But like so many things in this business, it's very simplicity makes it easy to overlook its value. As every school child knows, a pearl begins with an irritant. Years ago, people relied on the accidental introduction of an irritant, such as a grain of sand, into the body of an oyster to be the genesis of a pearl. When the oyster discovered that it could not eject the irritant, it began the process of depositing a smooth material on the irritant to cover the sharp edges. As the process continued, a pearl began to take shape. In later years, some clever persons discovered that they could introduce an irritant into an oyster by artificial means, thus almost guaranteeing a pearl. A curious thing happens in the process of making a pearl. The process of depositing the pearl material over the rough grain of sand continues long after the sharp edges are covered. If the oyster lives long enough and certain other conditions are met, the pearl becomes large and lustrous and beautiful, a far cry from the original irritant. As nearly as I can discover, there is no pearl without the irritant. The analogy is so obvious that it scarcely needs to be drawn. When alcoholics can no longer endure the pain of drinking, the process of recovery begins. Little by little, layer by layer, the pearl of sobriety is built. There are a lot of false starts and a lot of detours of experimentation before the process becomes ongoing and the pearl is formed. If all goes well, the pearl is formed and the process goes on long after the irritant is covered. The pearl of sobriety never stops growing in size or in beauty. There are a couple of other things that need to be said. Just as we make sure there is an irritant of sufficient size and discomfort in the oyster, we must do the same thing with the alcoholic. It is usually not necessary to introduce something painful into the alcoholic's life, because alcoholics' lives are usually full of painful things. What we must do is be sure we are not covering the painful edges for them, thus removing the necessity of alcoholics beginning a pearl. The other thing that needs to be discovered is the parable from which this little title was drawn. In the parable, the merchant discovers a pearl of great pride, sells all he has, buys the pearl, and goes on his way rejoicing. The final word seems to be that alcoholics frequently spend all they have, either in the pursuit of the ugly reality of drinking or in the pursuit of sobriety. It is up to us to make sure that when they pay the price, they buy a pearl and not a stone. Act as if. It seems to me that once in my uneven education, I read that William James used to say that a man didn't run because he was afraid of the bear. He was afraid of the bear because he ran. Whether he ever said such a thing or not, I don't know, but there is wisdom in the saying that is worth examining further. Very often, when we wish to change our behavior, we must begin to act as if, rather than waiting for a change to come over us before we act. The act must precede the change, rather than vice versa. Let us look at the person who seeks recovery from alcoholism for the wrong reasons. They say to themselves that they are laying the ultimate con on people by going to treatment, attending AA, and trying to follow a recovery program. Then, when they have thrown everyone off the trail, they can get back to some serious drinking. But a funny thing happens. While they are acting as if they want to recover, they recover. Maybe this is what we mean by faith. We act as if something was true, and lo, it is true. I don't think any of us understand the real reasons for our behavior very often. We may think we are doing something for some apparent reason, and they turn out to be for no reason at all. Rather than trying to spend too much time trying to find the ultimate truth, I think we're better off acting as if. We don't have to spend all that time trying to determine if we really believe or if we just think we believe. The results are often the same. After the fact. In recent years, when it was both profitable and fashionable to be in the alcoholism business, we saw persons receiving grants for every conceivable purpose relating to the subject, not the least of which were efforts to describe the alcoholic. One can only admire the determination of those who received these grants because they faced difficult times, but nonetheless they pressed bravely ahead. When we came to study a population of alcoholics, we were looking at both people who had been given the designation by someone. Given our admitted imperfection in diagnosing alcoholism, the alcoholic must be very sick before someone says, "This is an alcoholic." The persons studying the alcoholic went ahead saying that these people must have certain characteristics which make them alcoholic. Now, the problem, of course, is that by the time we get around to studying the alcoholic, they have been greatly affected using alcohol. After the student has looked over the necessary number of alcoholics, the answers were strange indeed. The conclusions that are reached are much like someone saying that people who are apt to have automobile accidents are apt to have a lot of broken ribs. Some people like to use the word pre-alcoholic in their studies, but this is obviously the result of flawed logic. How can one be defined as a pre-alcoholic until someone is sure one will become an alcoholic later on? Then how can one be called a pre-alcoholic when we decide one is an alcoholic? It just doesn't make sense. A good example of this type of thinking is the spectacle of one of the prestigious think tanks relying on the self-reporting of practicing alcoholics to discover whether drinking is causing them any problems. We have a lot to learn. Why AA didn't become a cult. Within my lifetime, I have witnessed the flourishing of many cults. During the Depression, many leaders came forward in the name of religion and social gospel with the solutions for our problems. I'll leave it to the historians to describe and name them, but they seemed to have some things in common. They were based on ideas of considerable merit, and in the beginning began to solve some of the problems that needed solving. Each cult, however, dies a death of excess. The leader came to crave the elixir of power and drew all the threads of power to themselves. Without the leader, the cult was nothing, and if it did not collapse in its own excesses, it died when the leader died. In the 1940s, we saw the cults of national leaders climaxing in the horrible cult of Nazism and collapsing only when the final cataclysm of war destroyed its leader. In the 1960s, we saw the cults of the rioters and the flower children, and in the 1970s, the cult of rock stars and the drug culture. The 1980s saw a cult of the self, money, and power, while the 1990s can be defined as the cult of fraud and deceit. Presently, we are seeing a strange reversal of the drug cults to cults that would deal with the consequences of drug use. Their purpose is impeccable, but as soon as they gain some success, the leaders demand that power be in their hands, and the purposes of healing becoming the purpose of power. These cults, too, will collapse because they bear the seeds of their own destruction. How then did Alcoholics Anonymous avoid the pitfalls into which so many have fallen? I think the answer lies in the willingness of the founders of AA to accept the guidance of a higher power and to accept for themselves a role of true humility. The admonition of the 12th tradition of AA to place principles above personalities says it perfectly. Those founders of AA did just that. As one studies the history of AA, one discovers that there was a time when AA could have easily become a cult. All the ingredients were there: charismatic leaders, a noble purpose, a large body of the faithful who owed their lives to the moment. All that was necessary was for the leaders to accept the positions of power and authority which were thrust upon them. Instead, on the 20th anniversary of AA, they deliberately surrendered all that power to others and returned to the sidelines. It's hard to find another place in history where the founders of a group that was on the brink of worldwide recognition and tremendous power deliberately and carefully divested themselves of that power and stepped back into the wings. I am awed when I begin to grasp the dimensions of their humility. This humility is why AA didn't become a cult. Decision-making. Many, most, if not all alcoholics in recovery display patterns of poor decision-making. They have made the decision to drink or use much of their lives, which has gotten them into trouble, and even after getting into trouble, they would decide to drink again. Their decision-making can improve when they get clean and sober. They will find the longer they remain sober and are open to learning, their decision-making abilities will continue to improve. It is simple. At whatever age a person starts getting into trouble with their alcohol use, returning to use without reflecting on their alcohol use, well, they become stuck. They fail to mature beyond that point. A person may be 40 years old when they get sober after 20 years of drinking and getting in trouble, but they have not matured much beyond 20 years of age. There is a lot one can learn in those 20 years that the alcoholic has missed out on. There is another phenomenon that alcoholic who has been sober for either a short time or even for years can experience. That is making seemingly unimportant decisions, which can lead to relapse. It usually starts off small. Small it does. The sober alcoholic will decide to visit the bar they used to drink at, saying to themselves, I'm just going to visit old friends there. I'm not going to drink. That decision sets in motion a series of events that lead to another seemingly unimportant decision, then another and another, and so on. Before you know it, person is drinking again. Whether it is that one lapse or a full-fledged return to destructive use, only time will tell. The point is the recovering person has to be more alert than their non-alcoholic counterpart when it comes to making decisions. They need to learn how to project possible outcomes of their decisions. The decision to do one thing means the alternative or alternatives have been eliminated. That decision then leads to a point where another decision needs to be made, and so on. How many times have any of us looked back and thought, if I had not decided to? This is not meant to put the alcoholic in recovery to fear making decisions. Rather, it is intended to make them aware, think carefully, weigh their own options carefully. Erring on the side of caution is usually the safest route, especially when you consider the consequences of a poor decision or a seemingly unimportant decision, but it may turn out to be important later. Choices. Continuing with the theme of the previous section of making decisions is a person's ability to make choices. Clearly, choices have consequences, but it doesn't stop there. Choices lead to consequences, then the individual must take responsibility. So you make a choice. Hopefully that choice is one that is well thought out with the planned tasks, planned to be taken to move that choice to a desired end or consequence. Or a choice can be made with little thought at all, but there are still consequences to deal with. It would be so nice if it were that simple. A boxer can have a plan, how they will beat their opponents, but usually that plan is invalid after the first punch is thrown. The same is true with making a choice, then moving forward with a plan. Why? Because there are others in our lives who make choices and make plans. Those plans can and sometimes do impact our plans, whether that impact is good, bad, or indifferent. The result may have to be that your original plans need to be modified to reach the original goals, which may be impacted by someone else's choices and plans, and on and on. Well planned or going forward by the seat of your pants, there are consequences, and as the consequences unfold, you begin to make more choices in response to the new set of consequences. This is what is called life. But perhaps the most important part is taking responsibility. Responsibility, not necessarily blame. Taking responsibility is essential to improve future choice-making, continued growth, and maturity, largely based on clear insight. That is, you must look at the consequences and honestly identify how much of the consequences are your responsibility and which are not. Those consequences that are your responsibility are those that are the result of your choices. Consequences that are not your responsibility are those that have resulted from the choices and consequences of others, as they have impacted your choices and plans. Knowing the difference between the two is what will impact how well we make future choices, but more importantly, speak to our integrity, honesty, and insight. Can they help me? It used to be true that all alcoholism counselors were themselves recovering. It was as if the profession chose the counselor. As time has passed and the more alcohol and addiction counseling has become more of a profession, the more non-alcoholic, non-addicted people are chosen as their career. The objection to non-alcoholic addicted counselors come from many of those who are in treatment. How can they understand what we are going through? First, with tongue-in-cheek. If someone in treatment or seeking recovery in other ways insists they be counseled only by a recovering alcoholic because that counselor can't understand what we alcoholics are going through, undermines their denial. Isn't someone saying, They can't help me if they haven't been going through what we have. Isn't that a kind of admission that they are alcoholic? I mean, if the person is in denial that they themselves are alcoholic, what do they care if the counselor is an alcoholic or not? Finally, everyone has experienced pain, grief, anger, loss, etc., whether they are alcoholic or not. These are experiences and feelings common to all humanity. Additionally, everyone probably has experienced compulsive behavior. You can't eat just one, as one commercial goes. It's a matter of degree. The non-recovering counselor has engaged in some sort of compulsive behavior, responded poorly to a major negative life choice, obsessed over a major loss, etc. The non-recovering counselor's life has not been a bed of roses. They may have been raised in poverty, may have been raised by an alcoholic and or mentally ill parent, may have their own physical and emotional life challenges. That non-recovering may not fully understand what the alcoholic has gone and is going through, but the common struggles we all have and can and should produce empathy, genuineness, and non-judgmental warmth, which are the beginning conditions of creating a helping relationship. There is room for everybody. At one point, it becomes necessary for me to decide whether I could carry the message of AA to the group of suffering alcoholics who were not members of any conventional religious organizations. Now, I knew that the only requirement for membership in AA was a desire to stop drinking, and that God, as we understand God, was the key to the spiritual nature of AA. Somehow that wasn't enough. Now, to refresh my mind, I went back to the well springs of AA. I reread Alcoholics Anonymous, the beloved big book of AA. I read Alcoholics Anonymous Comes of Age and As Bill Sees It. I even went back and read The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James, a book that was very important to the thinking of the founders of AA. When I had finished reading, my feeling was one of awe. After more than 30 years of attending AA meetings and listening to recovering alcoholics, I knew that AA was a spiritual program. I knew that the process of recovering from alcoholism was probably the same thing as a charismatic religious conversion. I knew that recovering alcoholics really did have a spiritual awakening. What I didn't grasp, and probably even now understand only in part, is how the infinite possibility that Alcoholics Anonymous makes room for everyone, even an atheist or a non-alcoholic. For example, how can I, as a non-alcoholic, presume to talk about AA to alcoholics? Read the 12th step carefully. It says, we try to carry the message to alcoholics, not we try to carry the message to other alcoholics. I think the omission is deliberate and significant. How can an atheist or agnostic relate to God as we understand him? It can be done very simply by changing God in one's thinking to higher power. What about an ounce of clear, rotten taste, vile-smelling, throat-burning stuff we call alcohol? Surely that is a higher power for the alcoholic. Now, it isn't too great of a step for the alcoholic to understand that there must be something higher than this chemical. So there is room for everyone. I can go to anyone who desires to stop drinking, and I can carry the message to them. The only thing I can't do, as one of my old advisors used to say, is carry the alcoholic. The message carries the alcoholic. Thy will be done now. It has been my privilege to meet a very few people who have found sobriety through an overwhelming, instantaneous spiritual awakening, and who have never, ever had a moment's doubt. Their higher power spoke to them clearly and forcefully, and their lives were changed from that moment on. I envy those people, for most of us take the route of spiritual growth with all its backsliding doubts and erratic progress. One person I knew seemed to have carried on quite a conversation with his higher power. Once he had this charismatic conversation, he asked God why it took 14 years of prayer before the answer came. God answered him, "It took 14 years before you were ready." Well, I can't testify that such a conversation took place, but the alcoholic was sure that it took place. His life changed from a street wino to a productive citizen almost overnight. That's pretty convincing. I can testify that the prayer part of such a conversation takes place frequently. Most of us can pray and with sincerity say, "Thy will be done," and mean it. When we rise from our knees and look around us, we wonder what God is waiting for. We really mean when we pray, Thy will be done, but let's have it done by Thursday. I'm really, really busy. We can accept no for an answer to our prayers better than we can accept a delayed answer. I guess our final surrender should not only say, Thy will be done, but also include, in your good time. A mustard seed. I have on my desk a mustard seed. An alcoholic I once knew had visited the Holy Land and returned with a supply of mustard seeds, each of which he carefully encased in a small block of plastic. He used to distribute them to friends, together with a little card explaining what they were and quoting Matthew chapter 17, verse 20, where Jesus says that if his disciples had even faith the size of a mustard seed, they could move mountains. Through the years, I have thought on this matter. At first, it seemed to me that a mustard seed was chosen because of its size. It's about as small an object as one could see with the naked eye and still know what it is. Even then, you need some help in identifying it. Another thought has occurred to me, however. Jesus didn't choose a speck of dust or some other tiny object. Perhaps because there is another message in his choice. The mustard is a seed and has in it the germ of life. A mote of dust dancing in the sunlight is sterile and cannot grow and thrive. A lesson seems to be that our faith, no matter how small, is large enough if it contains the genesis of life. Just as a seed may lie dormant for countless years before the conditions are right, before it bursts into growing, vibrant life, so must we keep the smallest spark of faith alive until in good times it can grow and bring good things to us and the world.